In the first days of June 1944, southern England was not a country. It was an armed camp, a coiled spring of men and steel wound so tight it could barely contain itself, ready to unleash a violence the world had never witnessed. From Cornwall to Kent, every road was clogged with tanks, every harbour was choked with ships, every airfield was packed wingtip to wingtip with bombers and fighters. The coastal towns had been evacuated and sealed. The hedgerows concealed entire divisions. Britain had become one vast military base, and it was aimed like a loaded gun at Hitler's fortress Europe. The numbers were staggering, incomprehensible. 150,000 men in the first wave alone. 5,000 ships, from battleships to landing craft barely bigger than a bus. 11,000 aircraft, bombers, fighters, transports, gliders, filling the sky in formations that would black out the sun. This was Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion force in the history of warfare. An operation so massive, so complex, so utterly without precedent that if it failed, it could lose the war. If it succeeded, it could win it. And commanding this armada, shouldering a responsibility that would have crushed most men, was a 53-year-old general from Kansas, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was not just a general. He was not just the supreme Allied commander. He was the custodian of what he himself called the Great Crusade, the liberation of Europe, the destruction of Nazi Germany, the fate of Western civilization. No human being had ever borne a burden like this. By late May, the invasion force was ready. Too ready. The men had been sealed in their embarkation camps for weeks. They knew where they were going. The secret was out among the troops. They'd been briefed, shown maps of the French coast, given their objectives. Now they just sat and waited. And the waiting was agony. Every day of delay was a day the Germans might discover the target. Nazi intelligence was good. Very good. British counterintelligence had fed them elaborate deceptions. Phantom armies, fake radio traffic, double agents spinning lies. But deceptions only work if you strike before they unravel. The men crammed into the landing ships were already getting seasick just from sitting in port. Morale was at its peak. You can only keep soldiers psychologically primed for so long before the edge dulls, before fear takes root, before go fever turns into dread. And hanging over everything was the political pressure. Stalin was demanding a second front. The Russians had been bleeding for 3 years, holding back the Wehrmacht almost single-handedly. "When?" Stalin kept asking. "When will you open the second front?" Churchill had promised June. Eisenhower had committed June. But there was one enemy Eisenhower could not control. He could control the armies, American, British, Canadian, Polish, Free French. 1 million men under his command. He could control the navies, the greatest armada ever assembled. He could control the air fleets, complete aerial supremacy over France. But he could not control the weather, and the invasion had to cross the English Channel, that narrow, deceptively innocent strip of water between Britain and France. 21 miles at its narrowest point. You can see France from Dover on a clear day, but the English Channel is not innocent. It is a killer. Notoriously fickle, notoriously violent. Storm systems from the Atlantic funnel into it like water down a drain. Tides race through it at walking speed. Currents shift without warning. Weather patterns can change in hours. Sunshine to gale-force winds in the time it takes to boil a kettle. British and French sailors had been drowning in the Channel for 1,000 years, and now Eisenhower was going to send 150,000 men across it in open boats. The weather wasn't just important, it was everything. D-Day couldn't happen on just any day. The operation was so complex, so precise, that it required what one planner called a celestial and meteorological miracle. There was a checklist, and every item on it was non-negotiable. Requirement 1. The moon. They needed a full moon, or as close to full as possible. Why? The paratroopers. The 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, elite American troops, would jump first, hours before dawn, deep behind enemy lines. Their job was to seize bridges, secure the flanks, cut roads, create chaos. Thousands of men dropping into occupied France in the middle of the night. They needed to see, needed moonlight to identify drop zones, to find each other after they landed, to navigate hostile terrain in the dark. Without moon illumination, they'd be scattered, lost, useless. Full moon, non-negotiable. Requirement 2. The tide. This was the nightmare, the true killer. They needed a low tide, rising, at dawn. Why low? Because of Rommel. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, Hitler's favourite general, had been given command of the Atlantic Wall defences, and Rommel had a gift for imagining how an enemy would think. He'd studied amphibious warfare, he'd walked the beaches, and he'd concluded, they'll come at high tide to minimise time under fire. So Rommel mined the low tide zone, millions of obstacles, steel hedgehogs, massive twisted crosses of railroad iron designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft. Belgian gates, steel frames 10 feet tall, wooden stakes with contact mines attached, thousands of them, called Rommel's asparagus, all invisible at high tide. The men in the landing craft had to see these obstacles, had to have time to blow gaps in them, to navigate around them. Otherwise, the first wave would be shredded before it even reached the beach. Low tide, non-negotiable, but why rising? Because the landing craft needed to float off after dropping their men. A falling tide would strand them on the beach, sitting ducks for German artillery. A rising tide meant the craft could reverse off, go back for more men, more supplies. Low rising tide at dawn, non-negotiable. Now here's where it gets truly terrifying. The combination of a full moon and a low rising tide at dawn, that specific celestial alignment, only happens a few days each month. The planners ran the calculations. In June 1944, that alignment occurred on exactly 3 consecutive days. June 5th, June 6th, June 7th. That was it. A 3-day window. If they missed it, the tides and moon wouldn't align again for weeks, maybe a month. The men would have to be unsealed from their camps, impossible to maintain secrecy. The Germans would discover the build-up, the deception plans would collapse, the invasion might fail before a single shot was fired. But there was a third requirement, the most unpredictable, the most crucial. They needed good weather. Not just good, perfect. Calm seas. Wind force 3 or less on the Beaufort scale. Gentle breezes, small wavelets. Why? Because the landing craft weren't ocean-going ships. They were flat-bottomed boxes with a ramp on the front. In heavy seas they'd capsize. Men weighed down with 70 pounds of equipment, dropped into 60-foot deep water in the dark, would drown by the thousands before they ever saw a German. Clear skies, a cloud ceiling above 3,000 feet. Why? The bombers. Before the first man hit the beach, 11,000 Allied bombers would pound the German defences. The bunkers, the gun positions, the strong points. But they needed to see their targets. Below 3,000 feet, cloud cover would blind them. The bombs would fall uselessly into the sea or onto empty fields. The German guns would be waiting, untouched. Low winds. Less than 20 miles per hour at jump altitude. Why? The paratroopers again. In high winds, men would be scattered miles from their drop zones. Units would lose cohesion. The airborne operation, the critical first move, would be chaos. They didn't just need a good day, they needed a perfect day. And in the first week of June 1944, as the 3-day window approached, the worst Atlantic storm in 40 years was brewing. The entire fate of the war, the liberation of Europe, the defeat of Hitler, the survival of democracy, rested on the shoulders of one man. Not a general, not a politician, not a warrior, a Scottish meteorologist, Group Captain James Martin Stagg, age 43, quiet, intense. A scientist thrust into the eye of the greatest military storm in history. Stagg had been appointed Chief Meteorological Officer to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Chaff! His job, provide weather forecasts for Operation Overlord. Sounds simple, it wasn't. Because Stagg didn't just have to predict the weather, he had to present that prediction to Eisenhower and the Allied High Command, men who would use his forecast to make a decision that would determine whether tens of thousands of young men lived or died. The pressure was unimaginable. But Stagg had another problem, a political one. He wasn't the only meteorologist working for SHAEF. There were 3 forecasting teams, each with their own data, their own models, their own methods, and they disagreed, violently. Team 1, the US Air Force forecasters led by Colonel Irving P. Crick, Americans, optimists. They used a technique called analog forecasting. Find a year in the past with similar conditions, see what the weather did then, assume it'll do the same now. Crick looked at his historical models and saw clear patterns. It's June, he'd say. June weather in the Channel is generally stable. We'll be fine. Team 2, the Royal Navy forecasters led by Commander George Wolfe, British, pessimists. They looked at the raw data from the Atlantic, weather ships, observation stations, barometric pressure maps, and what they saw terrified them. Low-pressure systems forming west of Ireland, storm fronts marching east. The North Atlantic was angry. This is going to be a disaster, Wolfe would say. Well, gale is coming. You can see it right here. Team 3, the British Met Office. Stagg's own team, scientists, pragmatists. They had the same data as the Navy. They saw the same storms, but they were looking closer, looking for gaps, for the margins, for the 36-hour windows between systems where the weather might, just might, be usable. Stagg's job was to synthesize these three wildly different forecasts into one unified prediction. One voice, one recommendation to Eisenhower. He was the most powerful man in SHAEF, and the most hated. The American forecasters thought he was too cautious. The British Navy thought he was too optimistic. Everyone thought he was standing between them and victory. But Stagg was a scientist. He looked at the data, and as May turned to June, the data was getting worse. June 4th, 1944, 4:30 in the morning, Southwick House, Portsmouth, Eisenhower's forward headquarters, a stately manor converted into the nerve centre of the invasion. The meeting room is thick with tension. Cigar smoke hangs in the air. Maps cover every wall. Maps of the French coast, of the landing beaches, of German defences. In the centre, the senior commanders, Eisenhower, British General Bernard Montgomery, British Admiral Bertram Ramsay, British Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, American General Omar Bradley. These are the men who will command the invasion. D-Day is set for tomorrow, June 5th. The first ships are already at sea, the slow-moving landing craft that need a 24-hour head start to reach France. The room waits, and then James Stagg walks in. He's not in a cheerful mood. "Gentlemen," he begins, his Scottish accent clipped and precise. "I'm afraid the forecast is unfavourable. Unfavourable." A British understatement that lands like a bomb. Stagg describes what he's seeing. A massive low-pressure system barrelling across the Atlantic. Force 5 winds, 19 to 24 miles per hour, in the Channel by tomorrow morning. Lashing rain. Rough seas with waves 6 to 8 feet high. Cloud ceilings dropping to 500 feet, maybe lower. He doesn't sugarcoat it. If we launch tomorrow, the bombers will be flying blind. The landing craft will be swamped. The paratroopers will be scattered across Normandy. It will be... He pauses, chooses his words carefully. A massacre. Silence. Montgomery, the ground commander, speaks first. "Can we risk it anyway?" Leigh-Mallory, the air commander, immediately objects. "My bombers can't operate in those conditions. We'll be sending men onto defended beaches with no fire support." Admiral Ramsay, the naval commander, is calculating. The sea state will lose landing craft, a lot of them. All eyes turn to Eisenhower. He's been sitting quietly, fingers steepled, jaw clenched. The weight of 150,000 lives pressing down on him. The weight of the war, the weight of history. He looks at Stagg. "Just how certain are you?" Stagg doesn't blink. "I am certain, sir." The storm will hit. Eisenhower stands, paces. The room holds its breath. Then he makes the call. "We'll postpone 24 hours. Issue the order." The code word goes out. Ripcord. Not Cromwell. That was the invasion alert. Ripcord meant recall. Ships already at sea are radioed. Thousands of them. Turn around, come back. The invasion is delayed. The men on those ships don't know why. They just know they're turning back. The relief is palpable. Another day of life. But also the dread. They'll have to do this again. And then, on June 5th, the storm hits. Exactly as Stagg predicted. A hurricane-force gale screams across the English Channel. Waves reach 15 feet. Rain comes in horizontal sheets. Visibility drops to near zero. Any landing craft in that maelstrom would have been swamped. Any paratrooper jumping into those winds would have been blown miles off course. Any bomber trying to attack through those clouds would have been useless. Stagg had been right. He had just saved the invasion from annihilation before it even began. But the crisis wasn't over. It was just beginning. June 5th, 9 p.m. The same room, the same men, But the atmosphere is different now. This isn't tension, this is desperation. Outside, the storm is still raging. Rain lashes the windows. The wind howls. The invasion is supposed to launch in 9 hours, at 6:30 a.m. on June 6th, but the weather looks apocalyptic. The window is closing. June 7th is the last day with the right tides and moon. After that, they'd have to wait until July. Cancel the invasion. Unseal 150,000 men. Watch the secrecy dissolve. Watch the Germans reinforce Normandy. The generals are on a knife edge. Some want to delay again. Some want to risk it. The arguments are sharp, bordering on hostile. And then Stagg enters the room. The arguments stop. Every eye turns to the meteorologist. Stagg walks to the map table. He's exhausted, hasn't slept in 48 hours, but his voice is steady. "Gentlemen," he says, "I believe I have found a gap." The room leans forward. Stagg points to his chart. A maze of isobars, pressure systems, fronts. This storm system will continue through tonight. But behind it, there's a temporary ridge of high pressure forming, a lull. I predict it will arrive over the channel by dawn and hold for approximately 36 hours. Someone asks, "What will conditions be like?" Stagg doesn't oversell it. "Not perfect. Seas will still be choppy, 4 to 5 feet. Winds will be force 4. Fresh breezes 13 to 18 miles per hour. Cloud cover will be broken at 3,000 to 5,000 feet. But," he continues, "the weather will be usable. Marginal, but usable." Lee Mallory, the air commander, looks skeptical. "My bombers can operate in broken clouds, but it'll be difficult. Accuracy will suffer." Ramsey, the admiral, is cautious. 4-foot seas. We'll lose some landing craft, but the majority should make it. Montgomery, ever aggressive, says simply, "It's good enough." Eisenhower turns to Stagg. "Just how confident are you in this forecast?" It's the question. The one that will haunt Stagg for the rest of his life. Because the truth is, he's not certain. None of them are. Meteorology in 1944 is more art than science. No satellites, no computer models, just weather balloons, barometers, and intuition. But Stagg has spent days analysing every scrap of data. He's consulted with his team. He's cross-checked the pressure systems. He's looked at the historical patterns. And he believes there's a gap. He looks Eisenhower in the eye. "I am confident, sir. The gap will be there." Eisenhower stands, walks to the window, stares out at the storm-lashed darkness. The room is silent. The only sound is the rain hammering the glass and the wind rattling the shutters. Eisenhower turns back to face his commanders. His expression is unreadable. Then he speaks. 3 words that will change history. "Okay, let's go." The forecast was perfectly imperfect. June 6th, 1944. Dawn. The weather was exactly as Stagg predicted. Terrible, but usable. Wind force 4. Fresh breezes strong enough to make the men miserable, but not strong enough to ground the aircraft. 4-foot seas, choppy, vomit-inducing, drowning men who fell overboard, but navigable. Broken clouds at 3,500 feet. Patchy, frustrating for the bombardiers, but allowing enough visibility to strike targets. The bombers flew. Most of them missed their targets. The clouds interfered. But the psychological effect was devastating to the Germans. The paratroopers jumped. Many were scattered. The 82nd Airborne had units land 12 miles from their drop zones, but enough men landed close enough to seize key objectives. The landing craft made it across, some capsized, some were swamped, men drowned. But the vast majority reached the beaches. The 36-hour gap held, just barely. By the evening of June 6th, 156,000 Allied troops were ashore in France. The invasion had succeeded, and then the weather closed in again. By June 7th, the storm returned. Worse than before. If Eisenhower had delayed one more day, D-Day would have been impossible. But there's another part of this story, the part that turns Stagg's forecast from a success into a masterstroke. Because the storm fooled the Germans. German meteorologists were looking at the same Atlantic weather systems, but they didn't see the gap. Their models missed it. Their forecast predicted the storm would continue for days, through June 6th, 7th, possibly longer. And the Germans believed their forecasts. Naval patrols in the Channel, cancelled. Too dangerous in the storm. U-boat patrols off the coast of Normandy, ordered back to port. Can't operate in these conditions. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, grounded. Can't fly in this weather. The Germans stood down. They weren't expecting an invasion, not in weather like this. And Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the most dangerous defensive tactician in the Wehrmacht, the one man who might have repelled the invasion, was so confident the weather was too bad for an Allied attack that he did something extraordinary. He left the front June 5th, 1944. Rommel climbed into his staff car and drove away from Normandy. He was heading to Germany, to his home in Herrlingen. Why? Because June 6th was his wife Lucy's 50th birthday, and Rommel, ever the devoted husband, wanted to surprise her. He'd also planned to visit Hitler at Berchtesgaden to argue for more panzer reinforcements. On the morning of June 6th, as the largest invasion in history was hitting the beaches he'd been assigned to defend, Rommel was 300 miles away, presenting his wife with a pair of grey suede shoes. When his chief of staff called with the news, Rommel reportedly went pale, said one word, "invasion," and immediately began the long drive back. But by the time he arrived, it was too late. The Allies were ashore. The lodgment was secure. The D-Day landing succeeded because the weather was bad. Not good, bad. Bad enough to convince the Germans to stand down. Bad enough to make them believe no rational commander would risk an invasion. But just good enough, for exactly 36 hours, to allow the Allies to get across the Channel and onto the beaches. Eisenhower's gamble, Stagg's prophecy, a gap in the storm that shouldn't have existed, that most forecasters didn't see, that the Germans missed entirely. The invasion wasn't saved by a battleship or a bomber or a tank. It was saved by a map, a barometer, and one Scottish meteorologist brave enough to find a fleeting window in a 40-year storm and bet everything on it. On June 8th, when the battle was clearly won, Eisenhower scribbled a note to Stagg. "I thank the gods of war we went when we did." But it wasn't the gods of war who made that decision. It was a man with a weather chart, staring into chaos, and finding against all odds a 36-hour miracle. Oh,